The morning Damon Holt put on his good shirt, the one he'd ironed 3 times the night before. His daughter Bria watched him from the kitchen doorway without saying a word. She was 9, old enough to understand that something was at stake, young enough to still believe things would work out. He'd told her the night before that he had a job interview downtown. An important one. She'd nodded like it meant everything, then slid off the couch and gone to her room. He thought she was going to sleep. But when he walked past her door 20 minutes later, her light was still on. He didn't knock. He didn't want to make it bigger than it already was. Damon had been a licensed electrician for 11 years before the accident. Not a dramatic one. Nothing cinematic about a man slipping off a scaffold on a gray Tuesday in October. Nothing heroic about the way the fall took out 2 discs in his lower back and left him lying face down on a concrete floor, while his crew stood over him not knowing what to do. He was 38. He had a daughter. He had a mortgage. He had a truck payment and a prescription his insurance barely covered, and a mother-in-law who'd moved in after his wife Renee passed, who tried her best but wasn't young anymore and couldn't manage Bria alone. He spent 14 months in recovery, physical therapy twice a week, the kind of pain that doesn't announce itself, it just sits there, dull and constant, like a phone that never stops vibrating. He went back to work too soon once, got sent home, went back again, got laid off when the company downsized. The gap on his resume was 3 years and 8 months long. He had applied to 41 jobs. He kept count on a yellow notepad on his nightstand. Not out of hope exactly, more out of discipline. The same way he made Bria's lunch every morning and sat with her while she did homework and made sure she got to school on time, even on the days when getting out of bed felt like something he had to argue himself into. 41 jobs, 11 callbacks, 4 interviews, 0 offers. The Callaway Group was number 42. He found the listing at 11:30 at night, which was when he usually did his searching. After Bria was asleep, after the house was quiet, after the day had wrung out whatever was left of his anxiety and left him sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Facilities Operations Coordinator, mid-level. The Callaway Group, a regional healthcare network with 4 hospitals and 2 outpatient clinics across the state. They wanted someone with field experience in building systems, electrical infrastructure, maintenance management. The pay was real. The benefits were better than anything he'd seen in 2 years. He stared at the listing for a long time. He almost didn't apply. Not because he wasn't qualified. He was, more than most. But because the space between knowing you're qualified and believing anyone else will see it had widened into something that felt less like a gap and more like a canyon. He applied anyway. He wrote the cover letter at the kitchen table while the rest of the house slept. He told the truth, that he'd been out of the field due to a workplace injury, that he'd used the time to obtain his facilities management certification, that he came back with more than he'd left with. He didn't dress it up. He just said what was true. 3 days later, he got a call back. The Callaway Group's administrative offices were on the 6th floor of a glass building in the center of downtown. Damon arrived 14 minutes early, sat in the lobby with his folder of documents on his lap, and watched people move through the space with the easy confidence of people who belonged there. He was wearing the good shirt and the 1 pair of dress slacks he owned. He'd polished his shoes the night before. Bria had watched him do it from the couch and said, "You look professional, Dad," in a voice that was trying to sound casual. He'd laughed, genuinely laughed, and something in his chest had loosened for a moment. The interview was with 2 people. A man named Preston, from HR, late 30s, the kind of efficient that reads as impatient, and a woman named Aidgale, the department director, who had a legal pad in front of her and didn't smile when she shook his hand. They started with the standard questions: his background, his certifications, his familiarity with CMMS platforms. He answered cleanly. He knew this material, he'd lived it. Then Preston leaned forward slightly. There's a gap on your résumé. 3 years, roughly. Can you walk us through that? Damon had prepared for this. He'd practiced the answer in his bathroom mirror more times than he wanted to admit. I was injured on a job site, he said. Saffold fall. Took out 2 discs in my back. I spent about a year in active recovery, then another year trying to return to field work before I had to accept that that specific type of work wasn't going to be sustainable long term. I used that time to get my CFM certification and study building systems management. I didn't stop working in my field, I just had to change how I worked in it. Gail wrote something on her pad. Preston nodded once, slowly, the way people nod when they've already made a decision. And your most recent position was? Carlin Electric. I was there 9 years. Who can we contact there? My supervisor at the time was a man named Joe Rafferty. He's retired now, but I have his contact information. Another note. Another slow nod. Why did you leave? Layoffs. Company restructured after a large contract fell through. That was, Preston glanced at his papers, 2 years ago. Yes. So the injury, then the layoff, then. He trailed off, leaving the space open, and Damon understood that the space was not actually a question. It was an invitation to explain himself, to justify the time, to convince them that the years he'd spent keeping his daughter fed and his back functioning and his mind intact were somehow worth something to a corporate HR department. He took a breath. Yes, he said. That's correct. The last 20 minutes of the interview were cordial in the way that things are cordial when the conversation has already ended. Gail asked 2 more questions. Preston shuffled papers. They thanked him for coming in. He shook their hands. He walked to the elevator. He pressed the button for the lobby. Standing in the elevator, alone, watching the floors count down, Damon felt the familiar weight settle back into his shoulders. The one that had been there so long he'd almost stopped noticing it. Almost. The doors opened. He stepped out. He walked across the marble floor toward the exit, his folder tucked under his arm, and he thought about Bria's face that morning in the kitchen doorway. He thought about the way she hadn't said anything, she hadn't needed to. He was almost at the glass doors when he heard of us behind him. Excuse me. He turned. A woman was crossing the lobby toward him at something close to a jog. She was in her mid-50s, sharply dressed, with the kind of bearing that doesn't come from a title but gets one anyway. He didn't know her. He'd never seen her in the building. She stopped a few feet away from him, slightly out of breath. You're Damon Holt? Yes. I'm Vivian Calloway. I run this organization. She'd been in a meeting on the floor above when her assistant had flagged her. Something about the interview schedule that afternoon, a note from Gail's department about a candidate. She'd glanced at the résumé on her way to another call, and something had caught her eye. She couldn't have said exactly what. Maybe the cover letter, which was direct in a way that most cover letters aren't. Maybe the certifications, which were solid. Maybe the 3 years and 8 months, which she recognized not as a gap but as a story. She'd asked her assistant to pull her out of the meeting. She'd arrived on the 6th floor, just as the elevator doors were closing. She'd taken the stairs. I'd like to talk with you, she said. If you have a few minutes, not up there, down here is fine. They sat in a pair of chairs near the building's east-facing windows. Outside, the city went about its business. Inside, Vivian Calloway put her hands on her knees and looked at him directly. Tell me what you actually know about building systems, she said. Not the version you give HR. The version you'd give me if I walked you into one of our hospitals right now and said the main electrical panel was throwing errors. So he told her. Clearly, specifically, without padding. He told her about the infrastructure failures he'd diagnosed at a sports complex in 2017 that 3 other contractors had missed. He told her about the ventilation retrofit he'd managed at a medical office building, coordinating with infection control because the clinical staff couldn't be displaced. He told her about the night he'd stayed until 4 in the morning at a school building because the boiler had gone out in February. And there were kids in that building who needed heat by 7 a.m. Vivian Calloway listened. She didn't write anything down. She asked 2 questions, both technical, both sharp. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The gap doesn't bother me," she said. "What bothers me is that you almost walked out of here without anyone asking you that question." Dahman didn't answer. He wasn't sure what to say. "I'm not going to make you an offer this afternoon," she said. "That's not how this works, but I'm going to make sure the right people see your file. I want you to hear that directly from me." She paused. "I also want to ask you something, and you don't have to answer. Okay, the injury. Is it managed?" "Yes. I have limitations. I'm not going back to hands-on field work, but coordination, systems oversight, managing maintenance teams, that's within what I can do. I've been doing it informally as a consultant for the last 18 months. She nodded. "Good. That's what I needed to know." She stood up. He stood up. They shook hands, and this time the handshake felt different. Less like a formality and more like something that meant something. "You drove here?" she asked. "Took the bus." She nodded. Like this confirmed something. "We'll be in touch within the week, Mr. Holt." The week was the longest 7 days he'd remembered in a long time. He didn't tell Bria. He'd learned not to tell her things that might not happen, because her face when things didn't happen was harder to carry than his own disappointment. He went through the week the way he always went through weeks. Made her lunches, helped with homework, drove her to her Thursday dance class, cooked dinner 4 out of 7 nights, fell asleep reading on the couch more than once. On Wednesday night, Bria came into the kitchen while he was washing dishes and stood next to him for a moment without saying anything. Then she said, "Dad, are you okay?" He looked at her. 9 years old, with her mother's eyes. "Yeah, Bug," he said. "I'm okay." She nodded. She went back to her room. He stood at the sink for a moment with the water running over his hands. He found a note under his bedroom door the next morning. Written in her careful, deliberate handwriting, she'd been working on her cursive on a piece of notebook paper folded in thirds. "Dad, I know things are hard right now, but you work harder than anyone I know. Whatever happens, I'm proud of you. Love, Bria." He read it twice. He sat on the edge of his bed and read it again. He folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of the good shirt which was hanging on the back of his door. The call came on Friday afternoon, just after 3. It was Gail's number. He recognized the 614 area code. He answered on the second ring, standing in the kitchen, one hand flat on the counter. The tone in Gail's voice was different. Measured, professional, but different. They wanted to bring him in for a second conversation, this time with the operations team. The role had been restructured slightly, she said. The scope had expanded. They'd like to discuss what a modified version of the position might look like. He asked when. "Monday morning," she said. 9 o'clock. He said he'd be there. He stood in the kitchen for a moment after he hung up. Then he walked to the refrigerator, pulled out the leftover pasta he'd made Tuesday, and put it in the microwave. Because it was almost dinner time, and Bria would be home from school in 20 minutes, and life did not stop to mark its own turning points. The second interview was different. Gail was still there, but quieter. Preston was not. In his place was a man named Alan, who ran the operations division and had the rolled-up sleeves energy of someone who'd come up through the field. Next to Alan was a woman named Trish, who managed facilities for the 2 largest hospitals in the network and had questions that were specific to the point of being tests. Damon answered them. Not perfectly. He said, "I'd need to look at the actual specs twice," which was the honest answer and which Alan seemed to appreciate. He described a systems audit he'd conducted for a mid-size clinic the previous year, walked them through his methodology, explained what he'd found and what he'd recommended and what had been implemented. At the end, Alan leaned back in his chair. "I'm going to be straight with you," he said. When Vivian flagged your file, I'll be honest, I pulled it up expecting to talk her down. We usually hire people who've been in system for a while. You haven't, but I looked at what you've actually done. And I've been in this field for 22 years, and I can tell the difference between a resume that's been decorated and a record that's been built. Yours has been built. Damon held that for a second before responding. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me yet, Alan said. But I think you know how this is going. He was hired on a Thursday. The offer letter arrived by email at 6:47 p.m. He read it at the kitchen table, same place he'd read the original listing, same cold cup of coffee at his elbow. Facilities Operations Coordinator, Regional Systems. Salary that was real. Benefits that were better than anything he'd had in 3 years. Start date 3 weeks out. Bria was doing homework at the other end of the table. He put the laptop down. He looked at her. Hey, Bug. She looked up. I got the job. She stared at him for a second. Then she pushed back her chair so fast it scraped the floor, and she crossed the table in 3 steps and wrapped her arms around his neck so hard he had to brace against the chair. He laughed. He held her. I knew it, she said into his shoulder. I knew it. He didn't say anything for a moment, just held on. I have to fill out some paperwork, he said finally. But yeah, I got it. She pulled back, her eyes were bright. Can we have pizza? Yeah, he said. We can have pizza. 3 weeks later, on a Monday morning, Damon Holt walked into the Callaway Group's main hospital campus with a badge clipped to his jacket and a folder under his arm. He parked in the employee lot. He took the elevator to the 3rd floor. He found the operations suite, introduced himself to the team, and sat down at the desk that had been set up for him. The first thing on his desk, under a paperweight, was a systems audit report that had been sitting for 6 weeks with no action. Someone had flagged it as non-urgent. He read it carefully. He picked up a pen. He started writing notes in the margin. He was still there 2 hours later when Vivian Calloway stopped in the doorway. First day? She asked. Yes, ma'am. She looked at the desk, the open report, the pages of notes. She didn't say anything for a moment. Good, she said. Then she continued down the hall. That evening, Damon sat on the couch next to Bria while she watched a show she'd seen at least 4 times. He wasn't watching it. He was thinking about the audit report, about the 3 items he'd flagged that he wanted to pull maintenance logs on tomorrow. Bria reached over without looking at him and leaned against his shoulder. You smell like an office, she said. Is that bad? No. It smells like a regular dad. He looked at her. She was watching the screen, not him. He thought about the note she'd folded in thirds and slid under his door. He thought about all the mornings he'd made her lunch when he had no job to go to. All the evenings he'd sat with her over homework when he wasn't sure what the next month looked like. All the times he'd kept going, not because things were fine, but because she was watching. And she would carry whatever she saw. He'd kept going. She'd seen it. The show played on. The apartment was warm. Outside, the city moved through its evening, indifferent and alive. He didn't need anyone to mark the moment. It was already marked. If there's someone in your life who kept showing up, at the job, at the table, for their kids, even when the ground wasn't steady, tell them. Not because they need the validation, but because they've probably been carrying the silence longer than you know.